Hey there. In this episode, we talk about the fact that it looks like we need to get some things done. It starts out with a conversation about climate change, which is a good example of the kind of things that we need to get done. There are some problems we need to address collectively, how the world is being the world. So in this episode, we actually kind of drill down on what is the we, who is the we that's doing this, and how much do we do anything, and how much just happens. We try to understand some of the bigger dynamics. We try to understand and explore a little bit the things that make us we and how some of that works. It has to do with our interdependence. It has to do with the fact that we cause each other suffering. It has to do with it has to do with certain cosmic things that make us that put us all in the same boat, you might say, and ontologically, or having to do with the nature of our being that makes us a we. And so we try to uncover some of that stuff. Now, this episode is called Frogs in the Maelstrom and the Big We. So it probably should have been called The Big We and Frogs in the Maelstrom, but I thought it sounded better the other way, so that's what I did. And so that's the big we, kind of looking at what is this big we and how are we becoming a big we, and are there cycles that move through that? And the frogs part, of course, the frogs in the maelstrom has to do with sort of how our perception works, and it's a topic that I visit a lot about. How do we experience the world? This is one of the we's that we share in the phenomenon of understanding ourselves and understanding the world and understanding the relationship between the two, and how we come upon finally what we're going to do, both individually and collectively. So enjoy Frogs in the Maelstrom and the Big We. As always, no script and no AI.
Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks. Life is getting a little busier right now, which is mostly welcome. I've been thinking about how hard it is to get things done these days. And this came up in a conversation I was having with I think it was with Ray, about Bjorn Lomborg's take on how we should deal with climate change. So he basically says it's um it's it's happening. It seems likely that it's happening. Whether or not it's man-made, it's going to cause some issues. But instead of a green energy revolution, which is extremely expensive and puts a huge burden on developing countries, why don't we look at the things that generate the greatest economic impact so we can shore up our cities and our infrastructure to deal with the effects of climate change more than trying to prevent it by reducing emissions. So, for example, helping kids get to school in Africa and like just basic economic development stuff. And then in terms of infrastructure, building seawalls and relocating homes away from areas that are at high risk for flooding and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds really practical, but the it seems like the amount of red tape needed to get anything done has exploded in the last 20, 30 years. And I don't have statistics on that. I just see like what it costs to build stuff at a municipal scale in the headlines, like new high-speed rail or
Yeah, I hear you don't get very far for a lot of money.
yeah, or nuclear power. I saw something recently that said the cost of nuclear power is 4 or 5 times in the U.S. what it is in in China because of um, for one thing, the supply chain broke down because it was neglected for 15 years, but also um, regulation, and regulation's important, right? Um, so I think this might be like a small is beautiful question, but there are some types of infrastructure that aren't as relevant for small is beautiful, like transnational railroads and
Mhm.
you know, a- airports um, and global supply chains, right?
Yep.
If
Yep.
we were all city states of 20,000 people, how how would we coordinate the um, development and construction and maintenance of big infrastructure? So I think this is kind of a big problem.
Yeah, I think it dovetails in with a lot of problems. It might be one head of a hydra of problems, is my intuition. When I always like to break down the terms a little bit. So when we say, for example, what should we do about climate change? The first term that I really don't get past is the we. And because everything that's bundled up in that we seems to imply a unified will, or the ability as an entity to move forward with a plan. And I guess I've come more and more away from that way of thinking. uh we might reformulate that question as to how much in general do we do and how much just happens. How much is a result of our conscious effort? How much is a result of dynamics operating on a large self-organizing system? Um, which kind of dovetails to the perennial question, which actually I was thinking in terms of some other things that I think will come up with some of our guests in the future, that has to do with the tension of a whole on, the tension between being a part and being an individual. And uh, the we implies our partness, and the whole that we are a part of is the question. The whole of humanity, well, how much unity is there? Um, my suspicion is that you get such a rotten deal when you're trying to build a high-speed railway, because the unifying will underneath it to make it happen was actually not what it appeared to be. And whether it was through lack of clarity or through lack of honesty or through like the creation of a system, and then people adapt to the system regardless of what happens to the system. Like, who is the guy that chopped down the last tree on Easter Island? And what was the conversation in his head? Like, well, at least we're going to have tea. you know, it might be a catastrophe, but we'll go down with a piping hot cup of tea or something. I don't know what, a full belly of cooked fish or something. And after that, it's, raw roots or something. I don't know. But, it's that sort of a thing where I think, there's this idea of the problem of the commons, where the we is very related to the question of authority. And where authority is foggy, then the we is foggy. And the foggier the we, the less are we likely to see conscious, resolute action come out of it. Does that make sense?
Say more about what you mean by authority.
Well, I mean, authority at its grossest level is the ability to say, "Hey, do this," or "Don't do this," and then people will either fall in line or laugh at you and walk off and do whatever they want. And that's been, that's gone through history. There's been this struggle, right? Lao Tzu says, when the people no longer fear death, you will not be able to control them. So obviously there's been some effort to control people, and herding everybody up into a we is most easily done if there's some authoritative voice, right? So that shows up as saying, well, you better take climate change seriously because we have these authoritative scientists who are saying that you should.
Yeah, or on the flip side, there have been personalities throughout history that have managed to galvanize the we to get relatively big stuff done. Um,
Pericles.
uh, I'm confused between Pericles and Theseus. Remind me what Pericles did?
Well, Pericles was the great orator that fired everybody up for the war. It
Oh,
didn't
yeah,
work
yeah.
out that well in the end, but the idea was, we're going to use rhetoric and we're going to get people fired up, not by appealing necessarily to their reason, but by stirring their emotion. It's probably a lot easier. There's somebody's PhD thesis. Easier to get people to go to war on emotion than on reason.
The way I'm thinking about it, I guess, is that kind of anywhere you look, you have competing interests, and the role of governance or the outcome in the we is finding ways to balance those competing interests, like
Mhm.
individual um, expression balanced with the collective good. Or
Yep.
I think in this case, regulation um, and uh, and innovation, let's say, or even if not innovation, getting stuff done in the real world. It's almost
Mhm.
a tiger dragon, um, uh,
Mm.
need to balance. And the more people there are, and maybe the more complexity there is, and the more polarization there is, the greater the gridlock resulting from the balancing of these forces. This is totally like, you know, just up.
Mhm.
I don't have data, but kind of conceptually how I think about it. And so this challenge in like building big stuff, I think shows up elsewhere too. I think it shows
Mhm.
up in getting a good bill passed without 700 pages of pork attached to it. I think it's kind of the same dynamic.
Well, of course, what leaps to mind now is Ibn Khaldun. And, he had this concept of asabiya, and you could think of it as social glue. Some people think of him as the first sociologist. And what he said was that when we suffer with people, then that gives us this asabiya, this cohesive feeling of togetherness. And he tracks cultures through, I think once again, it's 4 chapters or stages or phases. And the thing that distinguishes them is increase decreasing levels of asabiya. And you could think of those as decreasing levels of unanimity around the idea of we. In the first chapter, we is really strong. But the last chapter, there is a fundamental mistrust between those of us that have the authority to make decisions and those of us upon whose behalf those decisions are supposed to be made. But in the last age, the only thing that ensures that is asabiya, social cohesion, my compassion and my feeling usness with my neighbor. But the 4th chapter in Khaldun's system is called the Age of Luxury. Reminds us of the Shang dynasty, telling us this is probably a really old story. So a guy like Ibn Khaldun, who lived in, I don't know, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200, something like that, he'd already had plenty of history to study to see this cycle. And, they call him the first sociologist. This is a social dynamic. And we could say that sociology is all about unfolding that we. And it turns out that this dovetails into a lot of conversations. It dovetails into the conversation about pragmatism versus ideology. Um, we built a lot of systems. Of course, I'm reading Kropotkin still, and he's reacting to these systems, and he gives you a lot of his assumptions about human nature, how he thinks human nature will show up given different circumstances. And he goes completely the opposite to Ibn Khaldun. He seems to think that increasing luxury will, take the boot off the neck of the impoverished. And so naturally, and this is like turning inside out the argument of poverty causes crime. So then if we give everybody enough, then the crime will end. And it turns out that if we give people enough, they move straight into the psychology that goes along with the age of luxury, and their social cohesion is diluted by that more than enough. And Chuang-Tzu says, have enough is good fortune, but to have too much is to become confused. And this is very related to the type of confusion that he says. Lao Tzu, I have 3 treasures and keep them, guard them and keep them safe. And the first is never too much. Right. And so it's that important that and it's so, this is like the whole general topic, which we come up upon here on the show a lot, which is sort of like the maintenance and development of the human soul. Like, I have to have enough self circumspection to tell myself, okay, you've had enough. You don't need the 3rd tub of Haagen-Dazs, right? Or whatever, wherever your enough line gets drawn. That's philosophy right there. Where's enough, right? And
Yeah.
and your relationship with what is enough is your relationship with tied right into this other important question that I think is perennial, and that is, how much suffering am I willing to have other people go through for me to get what I want? Want being very intimately connected with this idea of what's enough, fully
Yeah,
knowing that.
and happiness, right? The evasive happiness. I want to go back to a couple things you said, but before we drill down more on this last part. So it seems to me like the idea of a we, or being a holon, like, it's very much up in the air how functional the holon of civilization could be. And because it seems like you go through these 4 chapters and the unanimity of the we declines, and then what?
Well, then typically you're in an environment of other cultures that are in different chapters. And so if you're in your stage of luxury where you have no social cohesion, and you verdantly or inadvertently, advertently or inadvertently brush up against a culture that's hungrier, that has social cohesion because it has suffered together, then their advantage goes to them. And we see this in prize fighting, right? Who seem to be the best prize fighters seem to be coming from the racial groups as they pass into America. There was a time way back when it was the Irish, and then it became the Italians, and then and they seem to be whoever was the race that was trying to make it, that was still willing to fight hard, and they had that, they weren't sated. They hadn't pushed back from the table because their bellies were too full. They still wanted it. And then we saw that, work into great black fighters and great Hispanic fighters. Now some of the greatest fighters to watch are Mexican and some great Puerto Rican fighters. And, so
and
there's an
Eastern European.
interesting, and yeah. So, no, there's an interesting thing. Yeah, particularly the Eastern Europeans have shown up lately. It's been very interesting. But so there's something about, this is in another one of my musings, is that all these people that write political theory about humans, they all have like a generic human that they plug in there. And it seems to me that maybe if you haven't traveled, or if you haven't read enough history, or maybe this is just general, the myopia of the human condition, we don't get how different other people can be.
Hmm.
Whether it's, from their cognitive model, from their cultural downloads, from their psychological dilemmas, the whole 9 yards, and just from the throw of the genetic dice, right? I mean, we
Well,
tend to,
and the cultural dice, maybe more, but it seems like one of the jobs philosophy tries to do is figure out what do we have in common. Like when we ask what the self is or what meaning is, I think we're trying to think about that across the board.
when we try to pull our foot up, when we try to bracket like the phenomenologists, and or to pre-identify what our prejudice might be before we undertake a hermeneutic task. Boy, that showed up with Kropotkin. I had all these assumptions. And then, for example, one might think that the the anarchists, the people pleading for communism, I think of them as idealists, as we've used the term philosophically, complete materialists, to the point of proclaiming we are utterly materialist, and
Maybe
we
maybe just in case our listeners haven't picked up on those episodes, how are you using idealist and materialist in this context?
well, that's a good question. Um, the idealist tends to be wanting to ground their things in a metaphysic. Traditionally, it's been a religious metaphysic, right? Obey the king because he's ordained by God. Whereas the materialist is more like, I want everything scientific. I want it to prove. I want certainty that comes from rationalism and a scientist picture of the universe. And which is curious because these tend to be labels that we put on ourselves, and they are at best orienting generalizations.
And how do you get from the anarchists and the communists or socialists saying things like, if everybody has what they need, the boot will be removed from the neck of labor, right? In the case of
Mhm.
communism.
Do you see that as idealist or as materialist?
Well, it's utopian. Um,
But think about it. Just say the sentence again. If everybody has
stuff. Yeah.
everything
Yeah. Yeah.
that they need, then our utopia will manifest.
Yeah.
The idealist would say, when everyone attains a state of virtue, then the world that will manifest from the inevitable activity of so many virtuous people will be utopia.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so in that respect, I mean, I guess we can switch the labels around different ways. We could say, well, it's idealist because it's never going to happen. And they would say, yet. Right. And then we get into that. Well, everybody else that did it, they just did it wrong, clearly, you know. And but there's some assumptions that are made. And it's interesting because it may well be related to the class that the theorist grew up in. Whether we're talking about Kropotkin, who was very wealthy, or Mamdani, who apparently is, happy to spend $8 on a cup of coffee, was when I saw someone saying, "How can this he be a populist? Look, he spends $8 on a cup of coffee." Now you put that wherever you want. I'm just saying there is an association that, and this was the big theme, was on the general topic of does philosophy matter? Well, our worldviews about important things like what should we do are based on certain assumptions that we make, whether they're conscious or unconscious assumptions, whether they're made by others and given to us and we go, yeah, it looks good, you know, or whether we arrive at them ourselves, those assumptions are there. And so, um, it's certain assumptions about humanity, about people around us, and I don't see any way for those assumptions to evolve apart from the experience of life. And that's why I'm always droning on about this hermeneutic circle, and that your idea of the whole is the thing that you reference to make sense, to gain coherence. And so your picture of the whole should be as broad and as dimensional as it can be, because then your reflections on each piece will be in a context of the broadest considerations and the broadest perspective, right? That's that argument. And so, which is to say that subjectivity is your friend and use it like that. And if you realize that subjectivity is your friend, then you want to be the subject of a broad exposure, if you will. If objectivity is the only thing that's important, then you could easily talk yourself into thinking that not having broad exposure just prevents you from confusion. And this is what a lot of times, right? A lot of our experts are experts because they've pushed everything aside so that they could focus on exactly one thing. I'm kind of making the argument that we sort of need that other dial as well.
Yeah, I I think that's kind of what this conversation is about in a way, because the tension between idealism and materialism here in the physical world with restaurants and bathrooms, we probably need some modicum of materialism, and right, like for our lives to be balanced, we need a certain level of stuff, right? Maslow's hierarchy, right? We need a roof over our heads and food in our bellies, maybe not too much, right? Um, and so that is materialist, and uh, depending on what we do with them, even seeking experiences could be materialist. Um,
Mhm. Certainly.
what I mean by that is I see people, for example, who like to travel a lot, and they come back and talk about all the things that they saw, but they don't necessarily talk about how they were affected. They don't seem to change
Mhm.
or grow as a result of seeing these things. So that they strike me as sort of collecting memories,
Collectors, yeah.
as so memories being a high level materialist pursuit.
Yep.
But so this is another place for integration, or just like regulation
Or balance.
and building stuff, right? It's another place for balance. But
Mhm.
but I don't see, or maybe it's because it just doesn't get a lot of press, what the how our society invests in the idealism side of that equation. Um, and it does make me think humans are, or the we has a tendency towards materialism. And maybe that is an evolutionary process, but it sure seems
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
we could use more virtue.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think if you want to see where the modern culture tends towards idealism, you don't have to look any further than postmodernism as a reaction to the materialism of modernism. And that's why what what you identify as is more important than what the materialist aspect manifests and confirms,
Yeah,
right? You're
but
set
in
free
practice,
to your subjective, and now not only is your subjectivity, see in my when I champion subjectivity, I say it's because it helps you resonate to get you closer to the experiencing reality. So I mean subjectivity in a way that does expands your you, not or we might even say dissolves your you because it's pulling that nail up, not a subjectivity that puts you in the prison cell of you. What the postmodernists do is they use this idealism and this subjectivity not to get you closer to reality, but to set you free from reality into your own reality. And that's a disaster. That's actually a form of mental illness.
hmm yeah, as we're seeing,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it also seems like in its practical application, postmodernism ends up looking like materialism too. Um, like showing up in a movement like critical social justice, all of the my lived experience is my truth stuff. To your point, is lays the groundwork for um, w- I, I'm I'm oppressed. You have stuff, and I have less stuff, and that's how I know I'm oppressed. And I want your stuff. It
Mhm.
still seems to come down to stuff.
It might not. I think that we would likely find that there are certain psychological predispositions. See, this is one of the reasons that I've said way back when be careful with reason because reason is a whore. Reason will do what your underlying psychological predilection or what Freud would call your infantile fixations, what they want you to do. So you're going to pick a philosophy that feels right to you typically because it comforts you in some way, not because it disturbs you in a good way. If you catch my drift, right? It's like if something's tuning me in closer to reality, I should get a whoa, Nelly, I took some wooden nickels there, or some bum steers there kind of a disturbance because I'd been actually, I thought that was real stuff when I put it in my sack. It's much it's much more comfortable to pick something that says, "Oh, look, I was right all along." How convenient, you know? Saves me a lot of work, and I don't get that disturbing feeling in the pit of my stomach
I
the
get a
same way.
dopamine hit instead.
Exactly, exactly. And and that's the danger is that you will tend to find evidence for the things you tend to go looking for. So knowing that, what are you going to go looking for? You're going to have to set your compass on something maybe deeper than just the appearance of phenomenon or what other people tell you seems to be the case. You may want to try a few things on. You may want to run some uh, uh, you know alpha test releases and see you know, run it up the flagpole, see who salutes, right? And so, but you know, most of us don't do that. Most of us just take everything, you know, under cultural advisement, and then we hope we don't get too far, you know, from the truth, but we'll never get far from the herd, you know, and there's a certain security in that, I guess, if not a certain boredom also, you know, or if also a certain boredom. But so, um,
Where do you see investment in idealism that's paying dividends? Like, and like, do you see movements that you think are cause for optimism?
well, I think that this is something where Buddha and Aristotle agree, and that is in this idea of balance. Buddhism gets called the middle way, and Aristotle's famous for this idea of balancing things in the middle. You know, so he says on one side we have uh, uh, cowardice, and on the other side we have foolhardy bravery, and the real wisdom is somewhere in the middle. And he goes through a number of things. You don't want to be too greedy, but you don't want to be too generous. The real, you know, again, that middle way is, you know, the can't be all the way one way, can't be all the way the other way. And so there is this idea that there is some wisdom in this idea of balance and regulation, leaning the boat kind of intuitively against whatever the strongest outer force trying to leverage on it is, you know. And that's a kind of an instinct, I think. Like, for example, as a martial artist, I've said before that whenever I sense that somebody's trying to leverage a fear trip on me, I got a little light on my meter for that. And when that light starts flashing, I immediately start to stiffen against that influence. Everybody has a version of that. When you watch an advertisement for something that you know is bullshit, you immediately you have the little voice in your head says, "Oh, piss off," right? At least mine does. Maybe yours doesn't. and but yeah, I don't know, there's a lot going on there. And I guess my point is that if we're not conscious about it, then we get downloaded these things. But if we're integrating our experience, and maybe that's the difference, you know, it's like, yeah, you get all this experience, you feed it into your hermeneutic bucket of coherence. I still don't have a good word for that. But uh and now it's, what do you do with that? Like, are you still just looking at the things that were glaring to you because you were hypersensitized to them from your infantile fixations, or your early childhood development, right? Uh, or are you, you know, sort of parsing this and sort of updating that model and sort of trying to track the repercussions of or the implications of those things? And that's kind of what we try to do here a little bit, is sort of, you know, like, well, if do you think, for example, the materialist view, Kropotkin and these other folks, they say is human nature is going to change if the material circumstance is changed. So maybe if we had a Shangri-La, you know, city of 10,000 Buddhas where everybody's a Buddha, and maybe if we took a person who is absolute, you know, evil personified, and we dropped him down in there, you know, like one of these experiments that, like they ran on Job. Let's see what he does, right? Uh, maybe the
They is doing a lot of work in that sentence.
oh boy, yeah, I don't even wanna bother and there's a whole episode there. Uh, the powers that be, you might say, yes. Um, whether that would this is the movie Trading Places, isn't it? It's, if all the material circumstances were to change, then would everything else change? Would the behavior change? And probably the answer is to some degree, and probably not fundamentally. Like, or maybe the the I'm not saying that the two, and we know this is the mind body problem again, right? The matter, the body influencing the mind, and the mind influencing the matter. And there's a push pull in both directions. But the idealist says, oh, the mind is, oh, can you see that creature? This line, he just flew right over my camera. I'm going to have to give an aerial repositioning here. There you go. Off you go, matey. Um, so, uh, and this is the question. This is why we ask this question of all the guests, because if you think it metaphysically, you may think, if you think it macrocosmically, you may think it microcosmically. And, we apply that to the question of the perfectibility of humans. Do you think that just material circumstances are going to perfect humans? My suspicion is that that would sort of defeat the whole purpose. But that's my predilection. And that's where now, and I'm a very material focused person in the sense that I wrestle with matter all the time. Like I'm building things and I'm, literally getting it all over me. Uh, but ultimately, I have to think that the point of things is more idealistic. So I'm there with Finnegan, trying to wake up like the rest of us Finnegans. And but I'm not there, and we haven't really talked about this, and it's probably not much point in it. I'm not there from logical reasoning. I'm not going to try to argue somebody into my position of idealism. It's based purely on experience that I can't reproduce for other people. It would sure be cool if I could, because then I go, well, what do you think then? But not being able to do that, I just have to say, well, were you in my shoes, you may well think the same thing. And so I'm still gathering more data, right?
I'm curious to go back to what you said early on about how much suffering am I willing to have others go through so I can have what I want? Because there's a lot to break down there. And I wonder if we can spend a little time on, uh, like for example, in the comparison you made of Buddha and Aristotle both looking for the middle path. Um, a maybe a middle path view of that is accepting that, there's a good chance somebody is going to suffer for me to get what I want, which is a horrible thing to say. I'm not sure if it's true, but,
Mhm.
um, so
I think
so
it is true to some degree. And I think the only solution is to balance that. I was thinking about this when I got pushed out of bed by one of the dogs. And I think we have to make ourselves a bit vulnerable to some suffering so that other people can get what they want and they need. And maybe those two questions are related, right? My will as a created thing and my identification with the creative energies, sort of from both sides of those. And that being the whole and the part again, right? Um,
I've seen people do this where they spend their lives literally analyzing the sources of everything that they consume, so that they can have as little contribution to the suffering of others as possible. And it's a full-time job, and they're still getting stuff, that has unknown inputs, in terms of labor upstream or
mhm.
metals that were mined in some way, some exploitative way, or
Do you know the Jains? Have you heard about the Jains?
remind me.
Jain? is the Jains. They're like came out of the same proto philosophies that Buddhism did. And one of the things they'll do is they were so ahead of the curve wearing face masks, but they wear a face mask because they don't want to breathe in any bugs or any microscopic organs, not because they don't want to get sick, exactly the opposite. They don't want to cause suffering to even those slightest of living creatures because all life is that sacred. My feeling is that there's two ways to be about that. There is understanding it intellectually, propositionally, and there's understanding it dispositionally. If
Are we
you
going to get
understand
to pack rats? I feel like pack rats are going to come up here.
backpack, I'm not. I didn't follow that part.
Well,
But
in terms of accepting the suffering of others so we could have what we want, I think pack rats.
oh, where we draw the line,
Yeah.
or mosquitoes. Yeah, I mean, you're not out of the food chain, nor should you pretend to be. I don't think. I don't think that helps. Um, But no, I mean, I think that there is a real thing there. If you're involved, if you're a parent, you understand that you've decided willingly that you're going to accept some suffering for others to get not just what they need, but also what they want. Um, and that somehow you have to make commensurable that with your being and having a self. And that maybe that's an intimate aspect of the we relationship. Maybe we can't really be in we relationship without some inter uh, um, intra suffering. There's got to be a sexier word for that.
Like an
Mutual,
exchange. That's
yeah, like mutual toe stepping or something like that. Like there's just no getting out of it. I mean, the dogs, they know that they do that to each other all the time, and they just take it as a course. And it's just what it is. Sometimes life bites your nose.
yeah, but self-awareness changes everything.
It changes the context. And yeah, context is everything. All meaning is context based, right?
Mm.
So so no, I mean, and that's uh this is like the conversation with Ayn Rand, right? Why I am not an what do they call it? Objectivism? Oh, please. Like anything's objective. But but because I do think that there are some real some real spiritual questions about that, we know life is suffering. We know that we can cause others suffering. We know that to get what we want, it causes us suffering and can cause others suffering. And we have history is filled with examples of people sort of out of control on that question of how much suffering they're willing to put other people through.
Or they don't even have the question. Yeah.
Or they don't even have the question. Yeah. And but they leave a trail of wreckage. And, Buddhism is pretty focused on trying to minimize that stuff. And at the same time, it is, it's like the lesson of Job, right? Or the lesson of the Bhagavad Gita. The real damage is only the damage that occurs to your soul. Um, and what is a man to gain if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? Yeah, I don't think you have to be religious for that to be a meaningful question. Uh, but yeah, I mean, these are the things that if we sit with it, if we have enough space and time to sit with it, it roots right into why do we do what we do? When you get up in the morning, after you've said, like the Arkham cartoon, Oh, Christ Almighty, now what? Which I saw this morning. You know, every so often he gets a lot of wood on the ball, you know. But uh, you know, what do you do and why do you do what you do? Because all that has to do with your interpretation of what life is about and who you are as someone living that life. And I do think that that time is well spent, and that the more consciousness we bring into that, the more it operates like a multiplier on the value of our experience. And life is short. That's another underlinable thought. Nobody realizes how short life is, right? Um, everybody leaves with a trunk full of unfulfilled plans, and so what that means is that multiplier is worth a lot. It's worth more than you think it's worth.
Can
You
you
can't.
explain what you said about the multiplier?
Well, it's like you remember how I've said before this idea of my hermeneutic whole, my metaphysical sensibility of the coherence of everything and of life, the universe and everything, and how all my life experience pours into that, but then I metabolize it, right? And that metabolization and the breadth of that pulls out certain themes. And then when today's new piece comes, uh, those themes are accessible to resonate with the occurrences in my life, to pull meaning out of them, to resonate meaning out of them. And the more I have that apparatus operating, the more juice I squeeze out of each new piece. The more life I get out of, the more marrow out of the bone of the experience of life. So that makes my however many years that much denser with experience, that much denser with soul progress, that much deeper into the riddle of what it is to be in the life universe and everything. And so, you know, that's why I say philosophy is the great multiplier, you know, and particularly while life now is trying to get you going faster. One more espresso and you might be able to catch up with it. And this was another one of my musings today, was that why pure, clean, easy reason doesn't work. And it doesn't work because you ever see those news clips on the weather when a hurricane comes through, and they got the poor weather reporter out there and he's hanging onto a signpost, right? And everything's blowing by, patio chairs and, you know, dogs and chickens and everything's blowing by. And he's there saying, "Hey there, Bill, it's really windy," doing that sort of a thing. Well, I sort of imagine that all of us are in that type of a cognitive storm. And we are just in a tornado of stimuli. And all those stimuli are triggering, because of the way we build meaning, all those stimuli are triggering a host of other stimuli. And the idea that you're going to track one frog as it flies by in the tornado, and oh, look, it hit the porch. Oh, look, it hit the tree. Oh, look, it hit you're not doing that. You're in the tornado of all these things. And that's why you run a heuristic engine, because the heuristic sounds like it should be a musical group from Europe,
From the
right?
80s, yeah.
But the heuristics is a method for handling tornadoes of information by melt by precipitating out large patterns from this maelstrom of bombardment of data points. And so that's why people aren't rational. because there's too many flying objects to be rational. You got to deal with this en masse. And that's a different operating system. The rational part says, oh, look, there's the rabbit. It's the other system that deals with all the other thousands of factors in the dynamic universe in which that little rabbit sits.
Yeah, and from you know, I at least one take on it is that rabbit um, is is what we notice because of the narratives that we've already internalized, or the heuristics or cognitive model or hermeneutic status that we bring to that moment in the tornado where the rabbit is the thing that is important.
Right. That
Yeah.
is chosen. And by what all mechanisms, yeah, remains to be seen.
The
Yeah.
powers that be.
But it's tunable and it's related to your parsing mechanism, which is that tune-upable thing, I think. I think it really is. And we've sort of, we started out in the beginning with the podcast of trying to talk about what the meter was. And that turned out to be a little more elusive. But what we're coming to now is maybe at least a grasp of the hermeneutic board in the meter. It might not, we might still have a few other boards we haven't parsed yet, but this idea of an experience collector metabolizer that resonates out patterns that for later identification out of the spaghetti plate of the spaghetti plate tornado because there's a delta T thing in there of novelty that keeps our processor spinning, right? Uh, so that's coming close to what a meter reading might be.
Yeah, yeah. There's that agent in there that is making sense um, at an unconscious level and publishing that to the meter that our conscious awareness can read.
Yeah, yeah. And realizing that the meter is always recording and processing that like a cow chewing its informational cud, that we're always, and I think that's one of the things that ceremonies do sometimes is you get these little ahas because little pieces of cud finally digested. And so yeah, no, there's a process there. And that's why a lot of these questions, like I questioned the we in what should we do, I questioned the who in the free will question. Uh, you've made some assumptions about who's going to be doing the free willing. And those assumptions have implications that carry over into your ideas about free will. And so if those assumptions are foggy, that's going to translate straight across to the assumptions you make about free will and happiness and all that stuff. Right. Um, and so, yeah, that's where that meter being able to do things that the pure reason can't do, um, is significant, and that most people rely on it actually more than makes some people comfortable. Put it that way. Let's put
Yeah, back to the disruption, right? Um,
Yep.
yeah. Um, okay. Well, that took a turn.
Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting circuitous path there that it may seem like a little bit of a mishmash, but it's actually a crossroads. And we're gonna, particularly with some guests that are coming in the future, I believe we're gonna be revisiting some of these places, contextualized slightly differently, but this is like the substance, right? The thing standing underneath it are those big philosophical questions, although it shows up as this or that particular action, what should we do, or what did they do, or why do they want us to do this? And that it goes all the way back down to those metaphysical assumptions sometimes, and which rely on our experience of ourselves. And so it relies on our progress as on development as a self. And yeah, so all that's in there. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
One big tangled mess.
Yeah. Spaghetti plate tornado.
Yeah, there we go. It sounds like it fits right with the Chronos in classic infantibulum.
Yeah. Um, and it could be a rock and roll reference at some point.
Never leave out the possibility.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Brian.
Very good. And we have some cool stuff coming up in the future here.
Yeah.
So tell your friends.
Yeah. Thanks.
Word from our sponsor.